Okay, I think she mostly has it set up. Thank you. I'm here to talk about the programmatic consultation for the American burying beetle for the Nebraska Department of Transportation and the next 5 years of their projects. So I am the primary author. We do have a couple of the co-authors from the Nebraska Department of Transportation. So if Ben and Matt, if you want to give a wave to the audience, so glad you guys could be here. We also had several Fed Highway people participate in this overall process of developing the programmatic BA. Oh, see that one? Okay, great. So I want to start off, what is the American burying beetle, or ABB? It's probably one of the coolest beetles on Earth, honestly. Might be a little biased. It is a fairly large carrion beetle. That is my hand. So to get relative size of how big the beetle is, it is one of the largest species of burying beetle in the US. So there are other species that do some of the same ecological services, which is eating carrion, but also burying dead animals for their reproduction. So they have a lot of specialized adaptations, which I have pictured kind of there. They're able to smell it from very far away and fly to that carcass. If they're doing the reproduction process of creating a brood chamber underground, they actually use oral and anal secretions to preserve the meat for their larvae. So not your typical beetle. And it is federally and state threatened. And the map shows it used to be about the eastern half of the US. And in the 80s, they started realizing that we're really not finding it. At the time of listing in 1989, they actually thought it was only on an island off of Rhode Island. But luckily, since then, we have found it in several other states, including Nebraska. And so why is this important for Nebraska DOT and Fed Highway? Well, we do have to comply with the Endangered Species Act and also the Nebraska Non-Game and Endangered Species Conservation Act. The major known threats, I say known because this beetle has been a little bit difficult to research over the years because of the way it lives, and we'll kind of get into more of those questions here in a little bit. But those major threats to survival that we do feel pretty confident about is habitat loss, reduced carrion sources, and increased competition. So what has changed recently to kind of precipitate this? And especially for Nebraska DOT. So in 2020, it was actually downlisted from endangered to threatened, and with a 4D rule. 4D rules provides specific protections for threatened species. This particular 4D rule states that incidental take due to soil disturbance in suitable habitat is prohibited in the Northern Plains analysis area, which includes Nebraska. Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Part of the screen shows me the next slide, so I was like, wait a minute. By spring 2022, this became a little bit more different for DOT because Fish and Wildlife had decided that some of the conservation measures that had been being used, which were kind of mowing and carrion removal, which was a way that we thought we could avoid and minimize by making, like, say, a construction zone undesirable for the beetle, that actually taking suitable habitat and maybe making it unfavorable in itself is an adverse effect and potential for take. So, maybe some valid concerns there, but then we're kind of like, well, then what do we do? And that was kind of a big question. And then by fall 2022, Nebraska DOT already has a programmatic agreement in place for all of their TME species. And because of some of these complications, they recommended ABB be pulled from that whole process. So now an even bigger question mark. But that led to, in 2023, a bunch of collaboration and planning meetings between Nebraska DOT, Fed Highway, Nebraska Game and Parks, Fish and Wildlife. Very lucky in Nebraska that Nebraska Game and Parks has been involved with a lot of the programmatic agreements for DOT. And so having all of those agencies on board, the final recommendation was to implement a programmatic approach for ABB consultation that streamlines the process and results in better conservation outcomes. And this was specific to federal Nexus projects. So kind of why go as far as the whole programmatic consultation? A lot of that was stemming from the uncertain impact assessments that 4D rule changing things. What does that mean to have soil disturbance in suitable habitat? Well, ABB is a habitat generalist. So just about anywhere you want to disturb soil, that's ABB habitat. There's a few places, obviously roadways, water, really short vegetation, pretty much everything else is fair game. So it makes it really difficult for not just DOT, but the agencies trying to review these individual project reviews. And so I kind of list here some of those important factors of ABB habitat and how they relate to what is suitable habitat, which again is a lot. So now we're not for sure how to process the project reviews. And it kind of started looking like too many projects might be elevated to formal consultation. And so to kind of get a feel for this, DOT did batch 4 projects, went through the full process of formal consultation and received the biological opinion. And this further solidified that need and want for something a little more streamlined, a little bit more certainty and some consistency. So we started with the Programmatic Biological Assessment, or PBA. So these are kind of some of the major steps that we have already gone through. And that included the first step of defining the action area. I'll have a map a little bit later that'll show that, but it's a pretty good chunk of Nebraska. And then we'll step through each of those other steps on these next slides. So we defined several different project types and started looking at how much each of those project types impact soil disturbance. And you may be wondering, why is soil disturbance so important? Well, a good chunk of ABB's life history is underground. So from October to May, they're underground the entire winter. We don't really know where. Sometimes it's fairly deep in the soil, sometimes it's not. So there's some uncertainties there. Even when they are active, they're nocturnal. So they're under the ground all day long when we want to do our construction and maybe the clearing and grubbing. So it really becomes, where's that soil disturbance happening? How much? And can we detect ABB? Can we know they're there? You know, how do we determine these next steps? And so we started looking at the different project types and amount of impacts. And so I titled this take estimation, but really what we ended up doing for the next 5-year, the program for DOT is looking at all the projects that were in the action area and looking at that soil disturbance. So it's not quite a proxy for take. It kind of is in a sense, but we didn't actually estimate number of beetles of take. It really is just those acres of soil disturbance in suitable habitat. Didn't put that in there. And it turned out to be only about 0.05% of the suitable habitat in the action area. So then one of the bigger steps of the process was, how do we do a project individual review? So we have a flow chart that was created to help walk biologists through the process and figure out what needs to happen. One of those pieces was the high density area that was created so we could use that for compensatory mitigation and figuring that out. And then also a lot of projects are going to need habitat mapping. So we want a consensus and buy-in with all the agencies that this is the right process to identify what's suitable habitat, what's unsuitable habitat. And I won't get into it too much, but we have another classification called unfavorable habitat that was driven by that 4D rule that you probably won't hear for a lot of other species that are listed. A little bit deeper dive into that high density area. So this does show that action area. So it's a pretty good chunk of Nebraska. And we used a data set of ABB trapping to be able to identify where were more beetles found. And so then we added a buffer, created what is now the high density area. Mitigation ratios are higher for that because the likelihood of potential incidental take should be higher. And so within that flow chart, we're always going to assume ABB presence if we're in that area. We're always going to be completing the habitat assessment mapping. All AMMs are going to be implemented. Compensatory mitigation credits are going to be calculated for all of the impacts in the suitable habitat, whether temporary or permanent. And we'll get to some of those steps in a minute. So, of course, this included the avoidance and minimization measures, especially since some went away. So we need to create new ones. Fish and Wildlife really pushed for like these kind of buckets. And I'm kind of glad they did, because it was a great way to evaluate whether we were really avoiding and minimizing for the beetle. So, and when was that happening? So this is an example of the table that's in the PBA. Also a big part is the conservation pathways or compensatory mitigation. Fed Highway really wanted conservation pathways used because that is the lingo they use for the northern long-eared bat programmatic. And so we kind of modeled it after that. The two top options, conservation banking and lieu fee programs, those are the most streamlined options. After a year of collecting the credits for all the different projects, if those two options are available, the credits can be purchased. It's all done. No further coordination with Fish and Wildlife and Game and Parks is needed. So that's hopefully part of the streamline. If they're not available, they'll be looking at offsite permittee responsible sites and applied research, which will require more coordination and approval by Game and Parks and Fish and Wildlife. So the streamline consultation involves the new form, the ABB evaluation form, that gets you to determine evaluation of effects, and it'll tell you if habitat mapping is required. And then you take all those impacts and you fill in the tables, and eventually you get your mitigation credit ratios. At the end of the year, that ledger is balanced and that mitigation is taken care of. And this is for the next 5 years. So it is a 5-year program. So this is kind of probably what a lot of you are really interested in, the overall timeline. What did this take? So I already kind of said we started in 2022, but more officially we kicked off in 2023, shortly after ABB was taken out of that programmatic T&E process. And we went as fast as we could because we really wanted to get this done because there were projects that needed it. And amazingly, we had a draft that Fed Highway reviewed and we started formal consultation mid-2023. We might have went a little too fast, to be totally honest. So Fish and Wildlife, Game and Parks, they had some questions. They had some concerns. So there was a lot of discussions that had to happen after that, sometimes at the very high level of the organizations, sometimes more at the level that those of us in the room that have worked on this were more involved in. Thank you. And so it took a little bit more time, especially there's the contractor borrow sites or contractor use sites. How do we put that into this project? Some of that's private actions by the contractor. What do we do? Are we going to tell the contractor that they're going to have to go do formal consultation because they're impacting so many acres? That's not really desirable. So it took a little bit to figure out how we were going to move forward, but we did. So earlier this year, or no, later in 2024, so about a year after those first comments, we gave another draft, requested formal comments from the two agencies, and that gave us a lot more solid foundation to finish the edits. So we revised, and then the best meeting that was needed for the whole thing, we spent like 4 hours, went page by page of the PBA, and every question and concern was answered for any agency or clarified, or, oh, I need more justification here. And so that was super useful. And that got us to this spring where we resubmitted for formal consultation. And as of about 2 weeks ago, Fish and Wildlife found the PBA complete and sufficient. And assuming Game and Parks, Game and Parks also agreed with that determination. I didn't necessarily see an official email. Yep, I got a thumbs up. Okay, good. Which that means the next step is Fish and Wildlife, Game and Parks working together on the draft biological opinion. It's super great that they're working together so well. That I do have further acknowledgements, including Melissa and Amelia, if you'd like to give a wave. They are both here from Game and Parks, and they were a huge part of getting this through, including everyone else listed here. And with that, I can take some questions.
If mowing was determined to be potential take, and I assume the mowing equipment could even be threatening when compaction as well, does the PA cover general maintenance, day-to-day maintenance, or is it just construction?
Yes, okay. She asked if general mowing and maintenance is covered within this, and it is described as part of the existing environment. So it is kind of a known, and it's more mowing to the frequency that it's maintained under 8 inches all the time. And most of the areas that is already occurring is already decided to be unfavorable habitat. So it kind of became a non-issue, but the mowing of the full right of way, which we already don't do as frequent because of pollinators. And so it worked out. I saw, oh, yes.
So I think this slide maybe explains, are there other species of beetle or insects that vary carrion?
Yes. He's asking if there's other species that vary the carrion, and I'm assuming there's more.
Mitigation bank like for.
That is a great question. He wanted to know what a mitigation bank looks like for the American burying beetle. And honestly, just really nice wildlife habitat, as long as it's not really, really wet. So like a wetland bank isn't quite synonymous. So if it's too permanently wet, cattail marsh, that's not going to work. But as long as it's ideally native habitat or native vegetation and has a variety of habitats that's supporting a variety of animals, because they're dependent on the animals. Their own requirements are a little bit more about the soils, but they really can handle almost any soils. It can't be too dry, which obviously the range dictates some of that. So, yes.
Would you estimate state in this PBA based on upcoming projects?
Okay, she asked if this was based on upcoming projects, and yes, we did get a list of the 5-year program from DOT. And then those projects, we started making buffers, and we basically took kind of a professional guess at how much acres of soil would be disturbed for those specific projects. And then maybe kind of added a little bit more buffer to say, we think this is how much we're asking to be allowed to disturb in the next 5 years. And it'll get reviewed annually by Fish and Wildlife and Game and Parks. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Projects that aren't.
Oh, yep. Follow-up is planning for new projects, which that's where we kind of added the buffer, and knowing some projects will get pushed. So we feel like that it was a pretty good set, that we already know that some of the things have pushed or gone ahead, but that we had enough different projects within each of those buckets that we felt that that was a pretty fair look. If it turns out it's not, we will have to reinitiate consultation.
I think a lot of the challenges that you pointed out here for this species and consultation has a lot of overlap with other challenges or other listed vertebrates. Of course, there's a lot out in the future. What lessons learned or recommendations do you have from going through this process?
So she's asking lesson learned for future potential other insects or organizations that want to do something similar. As much as I do feel like we had good collaboration and communication, there were still some issues with communication and who to include when and who's talking to who. I don't know if Melissa or Ben, if either of you want to chime in on that.
I would say one of the biggest hurdles to what we went through was we didn't have any conservation strategies for this species in our state. So we had no conservation banks. We had no NLP program set up. There just was nothing. And so I think if there are species that you're concerned about that are greatest conservation needs or that you see coming down the pipe, start talking to those nonprofits and those other non-governmental organizations about NLP programs and try to get some of that legwork set up in advance to further conservation of the species, because if we had had an NLP program already kind of on the books for this species, that would have made this whole consultation go so much faster in 2023.
That's a great point. So Melissa's just kind of overviewed that having some of the framework in place for mitigation, like the NLP programs or banking or state statutes, allowing for some of the review and the way that we went about this, that would have helped it.
And so just to go into that a little bit more, is part of also we struggle with Hartman, especially with executive and engineering, is why? Why is this a necessary thing? Why do we have to mitigate? We haven't done any mitigation ever before in the state. This is totally.
Well, that's not 100% true, but there was some in the past, but it's been a long time. No, yeah. Barely.
In decades. I'm talking about things that are, this is very new, especially in the current regulatory. So this is not something that is, there needed to be more wide in some of the DOT discussions than sometimes because there was different places where different agencies were at, and there is some agency that would say this and that DOT was understanding it, but DOT was not understanding it, and this was on DOT agency. There's communication breakdown in location.
Ben also added that even internally within DOT, several different departments asking why is this needed? We haven't done this for a while. And that getting through all of those questions was definitely a difficulty, and that's something that we'd probably try to spearhead if we were going to do this again. I will say if people are kind of still thinking about it and want to add questions to Slido, I'd be happy to reply on Slido as well. So feel free to do that, and I'll try to look later in the day. Thank you.